He called himself a nobody. That was the word he used. Not humble, not self-deprecating, just honest. The way a man who had spent 15 years driving a city bus through the pre-dawn streets of Hamilton learns to be honest. Elton Marsh, 34 years old, single father, bus driver for Hamilton Street Transit, Route 27, the one that ran from the East End through downtown and out past the industrial strip before looping back again. He knew every pothole on that route. He knew which stops smelled like coffee in the morning and which ones smelled like cigarettes. He knew his regulars by face before he ever learned their names. He wasn't looking for recognition. He never had been. That's what made what happened to him so unbearable. And what happened after? What 3 people did in a cold courtroom on a Tuesday in February. So extraordinary that the judge stopped speaking mid-sentence and had to set down his papers, but that part comes later. The morning it started was a Thursday in late November. The kind of morning Hamilton gets when the lake effect rolls in off Lake Ontario and the whole city turns gray before 7 a.m. Elton had been on shift since 4:30. He'd already done 1 full loop of Route 27 and was 20 minutes into his second when he saw her. She was standing at the Barton Street stop. Not sitting, standing in a thin cotton housecoat, the pale blue kind with small flowers, the kind that belongs inside a bedroom, not outside in November. No coat, no boots, slippers on her feet. She was maybe 75, maybe older, and she was turning slowly in a circle the way a person does when they've lost something and can't remember what it was. Elton pulled the bus to the stop. He opened the door. He waited. She didn't get on. He called out, "You okay out there?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were sharp, but somewhere far away at the same time, present and absent at once, the way eyes get when a mind has started to come loose from its moorings. "I'm looking for the pharmacy," she said. "I need my prescription." It was 6:43 in the morning. No pharmacy in that neighborhood opened before 9. Elton had 4 more stops before his scheduled break. He had a route to finish. He had a supervisor named Garfield who had written him up twice that year for what Garfield called unauthorized delays, which was the official term for Elton doing things like helping a woman with a stroller get her wheels out of a gap in the sidewalk, or waiting an extra 90 seconds for an elderly man who was moving slowly toward the stop. He looked in his mirror. 2 passengers in the back. Both had headphones in. He turned the bus engine to idle. He got out. Her name was Agnes Boutet. He found that out later from her medical bracelet, which she was wearing on her left wrist under the sleeve of her housecoat. She had moderate to severe dementia, according to the intake form at Hamilton General, where she had been a patient twice in the past year. She lived alone in an apartment on Wentworth Street, 4 blocks from where Elton found her, and she had apparently walked out of her building at some point during the night, perhaps early morning, in her sleep clothes. She was hypothermic when the ambulance arrived. Not critically. Her core temperature had not dropped below the threshold, but her fingers were white and her feet, inside those thin slippers, were dangerously cold. Elton had taken off his Transit Authority jacket, the navy one with the HST logo on the chest, and wrapped it around her shoulders. He had sat with her on the bench, one arm around her to keep her warm, and he had called 911 with his other hand. He had done all of this in 8 minutes. When the paramedics arrived, Agnes was holding onto Elton's forearm with both hands. "He's a good man," she told the paramedic. "He's a good man. I want him to stay." He stayed until she was in the ambulance. Then he went back to his bus, radioed in the delay, and finished his route. Garfield wrote him up a 3rd time. Elton didn't tell anyone about Agnes. There was nothing to tell in his mind. He'd done what any decent person would have done. He went home that afternoon, picked up his daughter Pia from the neighbor's place. She was 6. In grade 1, obsessed with dinosaurs, made her macaroni and cheese from the box, because it was a Thursday, and Thursdays were box mac nights. That was just the rule. And went to bed by 9 because his alarm went off at 4. Life went on. 3 weeks passed. Then a man named Brecken O'Clair walked into the 11th Division Police Station on King Street East and filed a report. O'Clair was Agnes Boutet's nephew. He was also, as Elton would later learn, the executor of Agnes's estate, a position he had assumed 2 years earlier after convincing Agnes, in the early stages of her cognitive decline, to sign documents giving him power of attorney over her finances. He drove a new Escalade. He had not visited Agnes in her apartment in 4 months. In his report, O'Clair claimed that Elton Marsh, Hamilton Street transit driver, had taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. He claimed Elton had removed Agnes from the bus stop under false pretenses. He claimed Agnes had been wearing a gold bracelet, not her medical ID bracelet, a different one, a gold one with a small charm, and that the bracelet had gone missing on the day of the incident. He claimed Elton had helped himself to items from Agnes's apartment when he accompanied the paramedics. Elton had never set foot inside Agnes's apartment. He had not touched her bracelet. He had not taken anything. None of that mattered yet. The police came to Elton's door on a Wednesday evening while Pia was doing her homework at the kitchen table, coloring a stegosaurus very carefully, staying inside the lines. 2 officers, one read from a notepad, the other watched Elton's face. They weren't arresting him, they said, not yet, but they needed him to come in and give a statement. There was an allegation. Elton looked at his daughter. She was looking back at him over the top of her crayon. "Can I call someone to stay with her first?" he asked. They let him do that. What followed was 2 months that Elton Marsh would later describe. In the careful, measured way he described most things, as the worst of his life. And his life had not been easy. His mother had died when he was 19. He'd raised his younger brother, Kwame, through most of high school. He'd had Pia on his own after her mother left when Pia was 14 months old. He knew hard. He had a whole vocabulary for it. This was different. The formal charge came 6 weeks after Eau Claire's report. Theft under $5,000, plus 1 count of exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The second charge was the one that kept Elton up at night. It carried weight. It carried stigma. It suggested something about who he was as a person, and once that kind of suggestion was out in the world, attached to your name, attached to your record, it didn't come out easily. Hamilton Street Transit suspended him pending the outcome. Unpaid suspension. He had a mortgage. He had a daughter. He had, as of the date of his suspension, $43 in his checking account. His union rep, a tired man named Dashane, told him to be patient. "These things take time," Dashane said. "The system works." Elton did not find this especially comforting. He applied for 2 jobs in the first week: a delivery driver position with a courier company, a warehouse shift at an Amazon facility on the edge of the industrial park. The courier company asked if he had any pending criminal charges. He said yes and explained. They thanked him for his time. The warehouse called back once and didn't call again. He told his brother what was happening. Kwame called every day after that. He offered money. Elton said no twice, then said yes to $300 because the hydro bill was due. He did not tell Pia. She was 6. She asked why he was home so much. He told her he was on a special break from work. She accepted this and went back to her stegosaurus. The preliminary hearing was set for mid-February at the Ontario Court of Justice on Main Street West. Elton's legal aid lawyer, a recent call to the bar named Preethi Sohal, was sharp and prepared and underpaid and carrying a caseload that would have broken most people. She told Elton his case was strong. She told him the evidence was thin. She told him the main challenge was Eau Claire, who was credible-looking in the way people who drive new Escalades tend to be credible-looking, and who had already given one interview to a local news website under the headline "Family Speaks Out on Elder Exploitation." The article had Elton's name in it and his job title, and a quote from Eau Claire that called him predatory. Elton read it once. He didn't read it again. The morning of the hearing, he wore his only suit, the dark navy one he'd bought for his mother's funeral and worn exactly 4 times since. He took the bus downtown because he didn't see the point of driving when the bus went right past the courthouse. He sat in the 4th row from the back and watched the morning cases move through, and he thought about Agnes Boutet, and he wondered if she was warm wherever she was now. He thought about her fingers around his forearm. He's a good man. I want him to stay. He wondered if she would remember him. He didn't know if it mattered. Eau Claire arrived at the courthouse with someone Elton didn't recognize, a man in a good coat who sat in the gallery and typed on his phone the whole time. Eau Claire was wearing a suit that fit better than Elton's, and a look on his face that Elton could only describe, privately, as satisfaction. The look of a man who had started something and was watching it arrive at its conclusion. The presiding judge was the Honorable Warren Chislett, a man in his late 60s who had a reputation among courthouse regulars for being direct. Not harsh, direct. He ran his courtroom the way Elton ran his route, on schedule, no wasted motion. Sohal had filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds of insufficient evidence. The theft charge was built almost entirely on Eau Claire's statement, with no corroborating witnesses. The exploitation charge relied on a characterization of Elton's actions that, Sohal argued, was directly contradicted by the 911 call recording and the paramedic intake report, both of which documented an elderly woman in distress, appropriately assisted by a bystander. The Crown had, frankly, a weak file. Elton could see it in the way the Crown attorney shuffled her papers. Judge Chislett had apparently seen it too. He had read through the materials before the hearing and had called the case to order with the particular energy of a man who already had questions. He was midway through reading Sohal's motion into the record when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Elton didn't turn around. He was watching the judge. He heard footsteps. 3 sets, moving down the center aisle. He heard the gallery murmur, a small sound, like a room adjusting its breath. Judge Chislett looked up. He stopped reading. He set his papers down. And those who were in that courtroom on that Tuesday morning in February would talk about this for a long time. He laughed. Not a long laugh, not an inappropriate one. A single breath of startled sound, the kind that escapes a person before they can stop it. Because what they are seeing is so unexpected and so completely, utterly unrehearsed that their body responds before their professional composure can catch up. Then he composed himself. He put his hand over his mouth. He looked at the 3 people standing in the aisle. Elton turned around. He would not cry. He would think about crying, and the thought would press against the inside of his chest, like something trying to get out, but he would hold it together, because that was what Elton Marsh did. He held it together. The first was his brother, Kwame. Kwame, who was 28 years old, who had a law degree from Osgoode Hall, who had articled at a downtown Toronto firm and been called to the bar 14 months ago, who Elton had driven to every single one of his undergrad exams in the old Civic because the bus didn't run early enough. Kwame, who was wearing his barrister's robes. The second was a woman named Celestine Bray. Celestine was a paramedic, not just any paramedic, but one of the 2 who had responded to Elton's 911 call on that November morning. She had a printed copy of her incident report in her hand and a look on her face that said she had driven 3 hours from a conference in Ottawa to be here, and she had opinions about the way this case had been characterized. The third was Agnes Boutet herself. She was in a wheelchair pushed by a woman from her care home who had agreed to bring her. She was wearing a proper coat today, wool, burgundy, and her white hair was combed. She was looking around the courtroom with great interest, the way she had looked around at the bus stop, present and elsewhere at the same time. But when her eyes landed on Elton, something shifted. Some interior dial moved. "That's him," she said, not loudly, just clearly. "That's the man with the warm coat." The gallery went very quiet. Judge Chislett picked up his pen. He looked at the Crown attorney. He looked at Eau Claire, who had gone the color of old chalk. He looked at Sohal, who was already on her feet. "Counsel," he said, "I think we need to reconsider the morning's agenda." What came out over the next hour was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no thunderous cross-examination, no single devastating revelation that changed everything in an instant. It was more like a wall being taken apart brick by brick. Each piece revealing the mortar underneath had never been there to begin with. Celestine Bray provided her sworn statement. She had been the lead paramedic on scene that November morning. In her assessment, Agnes Boutet had been a vulnerable person in medical distress, appropriately assisted by a responsible bystander who had done everything correctly, called 911, maintained contact, provided warmth, kept the woman calm. She had noted in her incident report that Agnes had repeatedly referred to Elton as the nice man from the bus. She confirmed that no jewelry had been missing at the time of Agnes's transport. She had inventoried Agnes's personal effects. There had been no gold bracelet with a charm because Agnes, according to her care file, had not worn jewelry in over 2 years due to a sensory sensitivity associated with her condition. Kwame, acting as amicus to Sohal's motion, entered into evidence a set of documents he had obtained through Agnes' care home. Records showing that Brecken Eau Claire had, over the preceding 18 months, made 3 separate transfers from Agnes's accounts totaling just under $40,000 to an account in his own name, under the justification of household management expenses. A justification that Agnes's social worker had flagged and reported to Adult Protective Services 2 months prior. Eau Claire, it turned out, had filed his complaint against Elton the week after receiving notice that APS was investigating him. Judge Chislett read the documents. He did not look at Eau Claire for a long time. When he did, his expression was the administrative equivalent of a temperature drop. "The charges against Mr. Marsh," he said, "are dismissed in their entirety." He paused. "I would further note," he continued, "that the materials introduced today suggest a matter of some urgency regarding a separate investigation already underway into the financial management of Ms. Boutette's estate. I will be making a formal referral." He looked at Auclair one more time. Counsel may wish to advise their client accordingly. Auclair's companion in the good coat had stopped typing on his phone. Elton stood in the lobby of the courthouse afterward with his brother's hand on his shoulder, and Celestine Bray shaking his hand, and Agnes Boutet in her wheelchair beside him, looking up at him the way she had looked at him on the street, that clear and somewhere else look, and saying, very quietly and with great dignity, that she was sorry he'd had such a hard time. "It was him," she said to Celestine, pointing at Elton. "He gave me his coat. I remember that. I don't always remember things, but I remember that." Elton crouched down so he was at her eye level. "I remember you too," he said. She patted his hand. "Good," she said. "Now someone should make us some tea." He laughed. Kwame laughed. Even Celestine laughed. It broke something open in the room, some held breath that everyone had been carrying without knowing it. Hamilton Street Transit reinstated Elton Marsh with back pay the following week. The union filed a formal grievance against the suspension. Garfield, quietly, was reassigned to a different supervisory role. Brecken Auclair was subsequently charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and breach of fiduciary duty. The case moved slowly, as these cases do, but it moved. Agnes Boutet was moved to a care facility in the West End, a good one with a garden, under the supervision of a public guardian. She had Tuesday afternoon art class and a cat named Biscuit who sat in the common room. Elton went back to Route 27. He knew every pothole. He knew which stops smelled like coffee. He still waited an extra 30 seconds when he saw someone moving slowly toward the bus. Garfield wasn't there to write it up anymore. There's a thing that happens when someone like Elton Marsh gets accused of something. Not just the formal process, the charges, the hearings, the legal machinery grinding forward. There's the other thing, the quieter damage. The way people look at you differently at the grocery store. The way your daughter's teacher gives you an extra long look at pickup. The way neighbors who used to wave now find reasons to look at their phones. That damage doesn't show up in a court record. It doesn't get addressed in a dismissal order. It just sits there, in the spaces between things, and a person carries it. Elton carried it. He carried it the way he carried a lot of things, without complaint, without drama, without expecting anyone to notice. He went back to his route. He made Boxmack on Thursday. He drove Pia to her Saturday morning swimming lessons at the YMCA, and waited in the plastic chairs with the other parents, and read whatever was on his phone. One afternoon, maybe 2 months after the hearing, he was waiting at one of his regular stops on Barton Street, the same block, more or less, where he'd found Agnes that morning, when a woman knocked on the door of the bus. She was in her 40s, bundled in a heavy coat. She handed him a card through the window. On it was a name and a radio station logo. 900 CHML, Community Affairs Desk. "We've been following what happened to you," she said. "If you ever want to talk about it." He took the card. He looked at it for a moment. He said he'd think about it for about 2 weeks. Then he called. The interview ran on a Sunday morning. Elton talked about Agnes. He talked about what it had cost him. Not in a self-pitying way, just factually, the way he talked about most things. He talked about what it meant to be the kind of person who stops the bus. The station received more listener responses to that interview than to any other segment they had run that year. Most of them were from people who wanted to share their own versions of the same story. The moment they had stopped, or almost stopped, or wished they had stopped, when they saw someone who needed help. The moments that don't make the news. The ones that just happen quietly and either get lost or get remembered by the person you helped, who holds onto them, the way Agnes held onto the memory of a warm coat. Some people go through something like what Elton went through and come out of it changed, hollowed in some way, more careful, less willing to extend themselves for strangers. That's a reasonable response. That's what happens when the world repays your decency with a court date. Elton didn't change. This isn't meant to sound like a fable. He wasn't some extraordinary person. He was a bus driver from Hamilton who made Boxmack on Thursdays and drove his daughter to swimming lessons and knew every pothole on Route 27. He was a man who, on a cold November morning, got off his bus and sat with an old woman in a housecoat because she was cold and confused and alone, and because it was the only thing that made sense to do. He didn't think about what it might cost him. He thought about her. That's the whole story, in the end. Not the courtroom, not Kwame in his robes, not the judge setting down his papers. Those things were just the shape the aftermath took. The story is a man getting off a bus in the dark and the cold and putting his jacket around someone's shoulders. Everything else was just the world catching up.